On a peaceful Sunday morning at my 5-hectare apple farm, I froze when my son, his wife, and her mother arrived with a moving truck without warning. My daughter-in-law stepped out, looked at my old farmhouse, and smiled. "This farm is gorgeous, honey. My mother is gonna love it. Driver, take those bags up to the master bedroom." She ordered the movers to take their luggage upstairs, as if the house already belonged to her. I simply put down my coffee and said one word: no. I am so grateful you are here with me today. Where are you watching from? Drop your country or city in the comments. I would love to know. This is Silent Revenge with Auntie May. This story includes fictional elements for entertainment and educational purposes. Names and settings are coincidental, but the message at the heart of it belongs to all of us. My name is Rosalind Hartwell. I am 63 years old, and for the past 3 years, I have lived alone on this apple farm, 5 acres of organic orchards tucked into the hills of Hudson Valley, New York. My late husband, Ephraim, and I built this place with our own hands, our own savings, and more early mornings than I can count. Every fence post, every irrigation line, every row of trees carries his fingerprints and mine. After he passed, I made a promise to myself and to him I would take care of what we built. I would not let it go. That Sunday morning in early July started the way most of my mornings do. I was standing on the second-floor balcony with a cup of black coffee, watching the mist lift off the orchard. The apple trees were heavy with fruit, 3 more weeks to peak harvest. The air smelled like warm grass and something sweet just beginning to ripen. I breathed it in and felt for a moment completely at peace. Then I heard the engines. Not one engine, two. A deep grinding rumble followed by the sharp blast of a horn. I leaned over the balcony railing and watched a large moving truck force its way through my wooden gate, the gate Ephraim built by hand in 1994, and roll straight into the brick courtyard below. Right behind it came Lyle's black SUV, polished and out of place against the old farm stones. My chest tightened before my mind caught up. The SUV door swung open. Clementine stepped out first. She was wearing a long prairie dress that swept the ground, oversized sunglasses pushed up on her head, and the kind of relaxed expression that belongs to someone who believes every room is already theirs. She reached back and took Cordelia's hand. Her mother blinking slowly at the surroundings, as if she had never seen open land before, and guided her out of the car like she was presenting her with a gift. Behind them, Lyle climbed out last. He kept his eyes on the ground. He did not look up at me once. Clementine walked to the center of the courtyard, turned slowly in a full circle, and spread one arm wide toward the farmhouse. My farmhouse, the one Ephraim and I mortgaged twice and repainted 4 times and loved beyond any reasonable measure, and said to Lyle in a voice as easy and certain as a woman reading off a grocery list, "This farm is absolutely gorgeous, Lyle. My mother is going to love having us here. Driver, bring those bags straight up to the master bedroom on the 2nd floor." The moving truck driver jumped out of his cab and grabbed the first suitcase. My coffee cup was still warm in my hand. I set it down on the railing. Something moved through me. Not anger, not yet, something quieter and more certain than anger. I straightened my back. I looked down at my daughter-in-law standing in the middle of my courtyard, pointing at my home, directing a stranger to carry luggage into my bedroom, and I said one word: no. It came out calm, not loud, not shaking. Just clear the way you speak when you have absolutely nothing left to prove. The driver froze with the suitcase in both hands. Cordelia looked up, startled. Lyle's shoulders pulled inward like a man bracing for cold water. Clementine stopped moving. She pulled her sunglasses off, blinked twice, and then broke into a wide, practiced smile, the kind she probably used in front of a camera. "Mom," she said, her voice warm and patient, like she was explaining something to a child. "You must be joking. We drove 3 hours to be here. We came to help you." The driver looked from her to me. He still had not put the suitcase down. I did not argue with her. I have learned over 63 years of living that arguing with someone who has already decided they are right is like trying to redirect a river with your bare hands. You waste energy. You get wet, and the river keeps moving. So instead of arguing, I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out my phone. Ephraim had installed the smart gate system in the spring of 2019, about 8 months before his diagnosis. He spent an entire weekend running the wiring himself, refusing help from anyone coming inside at dusk with grease on his forearms and a satisfied look on his face. He stood at the kitchen sink washing his hands and said to me, "This farm protects itself now, Rosie. You just have to know how to use it." I opened the app. 3 taps. I changed the PIN code and the remote frequency. The iron gate at the entrance of the courtyard dropped. The sound, it made a heavy steel clang that rang across the brick and bounced off the walls of the farmhouse, was enormously satisfying. The security alarm followed immediately, a sharp pulsing wail that sent 2 sparrows flying out of the maple tree by the fence. The moving truck was inside the courtyard. So was Lyle's SUV. Neither vehicle could reach the main road. Clementine spun around. She grabbed her car remote from her purse and pressed the button. Nothing happened. She pressed it again harder as if force might make a difference. Still nothing. Her smile, that wide, camera-ready smile, began to slip at the edges. "What is happening?" she said, turning to Lyle. "Why won't the gate open?" Lyle rubbed the back of his neck. He looked up at me on the balcony, then quickly looked away. The truck driver climbed out of his cab. His face was red, and his patience was clearly running on empty. He planted both hands on his hips and called up to Clementine. "Ma'am, I got another job at 4 o'clock. I can't sit here. If I wait past my scheduled window, that's a $300 waiting fee, straight to your card right now." Clementine's jaw tightened. She turned to Lyle. "Do something," she said, her voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "Go talk to her. Right now." Lyle looked up at the balcony again. This time he held my eyes for a full second before his gaze dropped to the ground. "Mom," he called up, his voice cracking slightly at the edges. Could we just come inside and talk about this?" I picked up my coffee cup from the railing. The coffee had gone lukewarm, but I drank it anyway, slowly looking out over the orchard where the apple trees stood straight and patient in the July morning light. Then I turned and walked inside. Behind me, I heard Clementine's heels clicking rapidly on the brick as she paced back and forth. I heard the truck driver say something sharp about his schedule. I heard Lyle make a low, tired sound, the sound of a man caught between 2 forces he did not know how to face. I went to the kitchen. I rinsed my cup. I put the kettle on. The gate was staying down. The truck was staying put. And $300 in waiting fees was accumulating on Clementine's credit card with every minute that passed. Some lessons cost money. This one was on her. An hour later, I heard the gate release. Clementine must have called the moving company to negotiate or simply paid. I did not go outside to check. The truck was gone by noon. Lyle came into the kitchen about 20 minutes later alone, which told me everything. He moved differently than he had in the courtyard. Quieter. Like a man who had used up whatever had been propping him upright outside and had nothing left to spend on appearances. When he was 12 years old, he used to stand exactly that way after breaking something in the house. The posture had not changed. Only the thing that was broken had. "Mom," he said quietly, "can we please just talk?" I poured hot water over my tea leaves and set the kettle down. "You are talking," I said. "I am listening." He exhaled slowly. Clementine's mother lost her apartment. The lease ran out and there was nowhere for her to go. Clementine thought maybe here just temporarily there was enough space. Lyle. I turned to face him. "This is my home, not a vacancy." His jaw tightened, and for a moment I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Not anger at me, but something closer to shame. He rubbed his forehead with the heel of his hand and said nothing more. Clementine appeared behind him in the doorway. She had removed her sunglasses and tucked them into her hair, and she was wearing the expression she always wore when she wanted something. Soft eyes, slightly tilted, had the whole performance. "Mom," she said, stepping into my kitchen like she had been cooking in it for years. "I was just thinking, those stairs to the second floor are really steep. For someone your age, that can't be easy every single day." She gestured vaguely toward the window. "That little cottage at the edge of the property, it's all on one level, no stairs, nice and quiet. You'd be so much more comfortable out there. We can take care of the main house. It would be one less thing for you to worry about." The cottage she was pointing at was a weathered tool shed Ephraim and I had used for storing garden equipment since 1992. It had a cot, a wood stove, and a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. I looked at Clementine. I looked at the shed. I looked back at Clementine. "All right," I said pleasantly. "Whatever you think is best." Her face opened up like a window on a warm day. She actually reached over and squeezed my arm. "You are going to love it out there, Mom. So peaceful." She turned to Lyle with bright eyes. "Call the moving company back. Tell them we still need them." I had seen enough of Clementine by then to know that arguing in the open only gave her more material to work with. The cottage was not a defeat. It was a position, and from a position you can move in any direction you choose. I carried my tea and a small bag of personal things out to the cottage. I set up the wood stove, arranged my books on the narrow shelf beside the cot, and plugged in the old lamp I had brought from the bedroom. Then I sat down, opened my phone, and pulled up the smart thermostat app that Ephraim had wired into the main house 2 summers before he got sick. Outside, the temperature was dropping. Hudson Valley in early July could turn sharp after dark, and that night the forecast read 41 degrees Fahrenheit by midnight. I set the cottage thermostat to 72. Then I scrolled to the main house controls, the furnace, the water heater. I switched them both off, not with anger, with the same calm you use when you turn off a light in a room you are leaving. I poured myself a second cup of tea and opened my book. Around midnight, I heard a sharp knock on the cottage door, quick and urgent. I turned a page and kept reading. A few seconds passed, then another knock, harder this time. I reached over and turned up the cottage heat by 2 more degrees. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. The wood stove kept the cottage warm and steady, the kind of heat that settles into your bones and stays there. I woke just before 6 to birdsong and pale morning light coming through the small window above my cot. I put the kettle on splashed cold water on my face and stepped outside to check on the orchard. The apple trees were doing what they always did, standing patient and unhurried, heavy with fruit that was not quite ready but getting there. I walked the eastern row, slowly touching a branch here, checking the color of a skin there. Ephraim used to say that apple trees never lied to you. They always told you exactly where they were. I was halfway down the 3rd row when I heard Clementine's voice drifting across the orchard from the direction of the main house, but it was a different voice than the one I had heard yesterday, softer, warmer, the kind of voice that belongs to someone performing for an audience. I stopped walking and listened. She had set up her equipment in the open grass between the cottage and the first row of trees, a tripod, a stabilizer, a ring light running off a portable battery pack, and 2 phones positioned at different angles. She was wearing a fresh prairie dress, this one pale yellow, her hair loose and carefully arranged to look carelessly arranged. She was speaking directly into the nearest camera, with her hand pressed to her chest and her eyes glistening on cue. "Hey everyone, it's Clem. I want to share something really personal today." Her voice caught perfectly on the word personal. "We made a big decision as a family. We moved in with my mother-in-law to help take care of her. She lost her husband 3 years ago, and she's been out here completely alone ever since. It breaks my heart." She paused to let that land. "It's a lot of work, but family takes care of family. And this place—" She turned slowly to show the orchard behind her, arms open wide. "Isn't it just absolutely breathtaking?" The comment section, I learned later, erupted immediately. People typed things like "so sweet" and "what a good heart," and "I wish my daughter-in-law was like this." I walked back to the cottage. I picked up my phone from the windowsill. I opened the irrigation app, the one Ephraim had built into the orchard's underground sprinkler system to protect the trees during dry spells. I selected Zone 2, the zone that covered the open grass between the cottage and the first row of trees. I pressed the button. The ground beneath Clementine's feet erupted. 6 high-pressure sprinkler heads shot up from the soil simultaneously and unleashed full-force jets of cold water in every direction. The sound was immediate and magnificent, a rushing, hissing wall of water that hit Clementine square in the face before she could process what was happening. She screamed. Both phones went down. The ring light toppled sideways into the wet grass. The gimbal stabilizer spun out of her hand and landed in a puddle with a hollow crack. The live stream ran for another 43 seconds before the drenched phone finally gave out. 5,200 people watched every second of it. I set my own phone back on the windowsill. Through the cottage window, I could see Clementine standing in the middle of the sprinkler zone, soaked through to the skin mascara running in dark lines down both cheeks, her yellow dress plastered flat against her legs. She turned and looked directly at the cottage window. Her expression had changed completely. The warmth was gone. The performance was gone. What was left was something harder and colder, the face of someone recalculating. I picked up my tea and took a slow sip. She was not finished. I could see that clearly, but then again, neither was I. By mid-afternoon, Clementine had changed into dry clothes and rebuilt her composure the way she always did, quickly, completely, and without any outward acknowledgement that anything had gone wrong. That was the thing about her. She did not absorb setbacks. She redirected them. I was in the cottage sorting through the season's harvest records when I heard voices coming from the far end of the property. Unfamiliar voices. Young, loud, enthusiastic, the kind that belong to people who have never worked a day on a farm and find everything about one charming. I would learn later that Clementine had sent the invitations the night before a private message to 6 lifestyle accounts she followed, offering them a free morning at a working, organic farm in exchange for tagged content. Hudson Valley was 2 hours from the city. For people who made their living chasing aesthetic backdrops, that was nothing. I looked through the cottage window toward the stable. Apollo stood inside his paddock, ears pricked forward, watching a group of 6 strangers approach his fence with cameras raised. He was a Tennessee walker, deep chestnut with a white blaze down his nose, and Ephraim had spent 3 years training him before his illness made riding impossible. Apollo was the last significant thing Ephraim had purchased before his diagnosis. $50,000 and worth every cent, not for the money, but for what he represented. Clementine was leading the group. She had a fresh face of makeup and a new energy that made my stomach turn. I could hear her from where I stood. "He's incredibly gentle." She was telling them, her hand already reaching for the stable latch. "You'll each get a turn. I'm thinking 15 minutes per person, maybe some pose shots by the fence." She pulled at the latch. Nothing moved. I had installed a biometric fingerprint lock on the stable door the week after Ephraim's funeral. The locksmith had looked at me sideways when I requested it, but I had been firm. Apollo was not a photo opportunity. He was a responsibility. Clementine pulled again harder. Then she looked around the ground, found a fist-sized stone near the fence post, and used it to strike the old mechanical backup lock on the outer frame. The security alarm was immediate and absolute. A sharp, piercing wail that sent Apollo wheeling backward in his paddock, hooves striking the ground in panic. The alarm was wired directly to the Ulster County Sheriff's Department, another of Ephraim's quiet preparations that I had maintained after he was gone. 11 minutes later, a patrol vehicle came up the farm road with lights on. 2 officers stepped out. Deputy Harris, broad-shouldered and unhurried, and Deputy Morales, younger, with a notepad already in hand. The 6 visitors had retreated to the driveway and were climbing back into their cars, one by one, suddenly very interested in leaving. Deputy Harris looked at the cracked lock casing. He looked at Clementine. He looked at me, standing at the cottage door with my arms folded. "Ma'am," he said to Clementine, "did you strike this lock with the intent to gain entry to the structure?" Clementine opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I'm family," she said finally. "This is my mother-in-law's property." "That's not what I asked," Deputy Harris said. Deputy Morales wrote steadily in his notepad. The citation came to $500 criminal mischief under New York penal law, Section 145.00, which covers intentional damage to another person's property. Clementine's hand trembled visibly as she signed her name at the bottom of the form. I walked to the paddock fence after the deputies left. Apollo came to me immediately, pushing his nose against my palm, his breath warm and grass-sweet. I scratched the flat of his cheek the way Ephraim used to. "Nobody's using you for content," I told him quietly. He exhaled a long, slow breath and rested his head against my shoulder. I was up before sunrise the next morning the way I always am during the weeks leading up to harvest. There is something about that particular darkness the hour before the sky decides what color it wants to be that has always felt like mine alone. I lit the wood stove, measured out my coffee, and started on a pie. Apple pie has always been my clearest form of thinking, the repetition of it, peeling, slicing, layering, crimping. The edges of the crust settle something in my mind that nothing else quite reaches. By the time the pie went into the oven, I had decided that I was going to let the week play out without forcing anything. Whatever Clementine was going to do next, she was going to do it, and I was going to be ready. Around 8 in the morning, I carried the finished pie outside on a dish towel to let it cool on the cottage steps. The smell of cinnamon and warm apple drifted out across the yard, and within a few minutes, I heard footsteps on the gravel path. Cordelia appeared at the corner of the cottage, moving slowly, hands clasped in front of her. She looked like a woman who had not slept well and was trying not to show it. There were shadows under her eyes and a careful quality to the way she held herself, as though she was not entirely sure she was welcome. "That smells wonderful," she said softly. "There is plenty." I told her. "Sit down." She sat on the low wooden bench beside the cottage door, and I cut her a generous slice. She accepted it with both hands and ate without speaking for a while, looking out at the orchard. A cardinal landed on the fence post nearest us, bright as a match head, and she watched it with an expression I recognized, the look of someone desperate for something ordinary and peaceful. "Your daughter tells you things," I said eventually. "Not always the truth of them, but things." Cordelia's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She set it down on the edge of the plate. "She told me you were lonely," she said quietly. "She told me you had asked for company." I did not answer that. There was no need to. We were still sitting there when Clementine came out of the main house. She crossed the yard quickly, her eyes moving between her mother and me with an expression I could not quite read. She bent down and whispered something close to Cordelia's ear. I saw Cordelia's shoulders rise and then fall. She set her plate down on the bench, stood up slowly, and walked with Clementine toward the center of the yard. Then Cordelia sat down on the ground. Clementine straightened up, pressed both hands to her cheeks, and began screaming for someone to call 911, her voice climbing high and sharp across the property. "She collapsed. She's not breathing right. Someone help, please." I walked to the cottage door and took my iPad from the shelf beside the entrance. When the ambulance arrived 8 minutes later, EMT Jennifer and her partner Sam came through the gate at a jog. I met them in the yard and held out the tablet without a word. The footage was clear and steady. The angle from the camera above the cottage door caught everything. Cordelia sitting upright, eating pie, laughing at something, the cardinal on the fence post, visible in the corner of the frame. Then Clementine crossing the yard, bending to whisper. The long pause, Cordelia standing, walking carefully to the center of the yard and lowering herself deliberately to the ground. EMT Jennifer watched the full clip twice. Then she looked at Clementine. Clementine's mouth opened. Nothing came out, not a single word, not one syllable of explanation. Cordelia was already on her feet. Her face had gone the deep, painful red of someone who knows exactly what they have just been seen doing. She pressed one hand flat against her sternum and walked straight back toward the main house without looking at anyone. But at the cottage steps, she stopped, just for a moment. She turned and looked at me over her shoulder, and what I saw in her eyes was not anger, and it was not embarrassment. It was the beginning of something else entirely. Before I tell you what Rosalind discovered that changed everything, comment the number 7 below, so I know you are still here with me. And a quick note, this story weaves in some fictional details for storytelling purposes. Parts of it may not reflect events exactly as they happened. If that is not the kind of content you are looking for, this is a good place to step away, and I completely understand. The weeks that followed settled into an uneasy quiet. Clementine stayed mostly inside the main house, appearing at meals with the careful composure of someone conserving energy for the next move. Cordelia spent more time outdoors, walking the orchard rows in the early mornings, sitting on the porch steps with her tea, watching the trees with an expression I was beginning to recognize. She was doing what people do when they are trying to reconcile what they believed with what they have seen. I let her work through it at her own pace. Some things cannot be rushed. Margaret came by on the first Thursday of August the way she always did before the early harvest checks began. She arrived with a canvas tote full of empty boxes, her reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the particular look of a woman who has already heard more than she is letting on. Her nearest neighbor was less than half a mile down the road. Sound carried in these hills. We worked side by side at the long packing table in the barn, checking the first test-picked apples for sizing and color. Margaret held one up to the light and turned it slowly. "I heard sirens out here twice last week," she said without looking at me. "You did," I agreed, "and I see a moving truck's tire tracks still ground into your brick courtyard. You have sharp eyes, Margaret." She set the apple in the box and reached for another one. "How long are you planning to let this go on, Rosie?" "Until it's finished," I said. She made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sigh, and we went back to work. My phone rang at 9:47. I recognized Clementine's number and let it ring once more before I answered. "The school called this morning." Her voice had the tight-clipped quality of someone working hard to stay controlled. "The automatic tuition payment didn't go through. Our account shows nothing deposited. What did you do?" I set down the apple I was holding and dusted my hands on my work apron. "It was not supposed to reach your account," I said. "It never was your money to begin with, Clementine. That payment has come every month for 2 years. As a gift I chose to give directly to Mason and Lily." I kept my voice even the way you keep a flame steady in a draft. "I have opened 2 separate custodial accounts, one in Mason's name, one in Lily's under the New York Uniform Transfers to Minors Act. Every dollar I intend for those children will go directly into their future. Neither you nor anyone else can access those funds until each child turns 18. The silence on her end had a particular texture, not empty but pressurized. "You had absolutely no right to change that without telling us," she said, and her control slipped enough that I could hear the anger underneath it, hot and close to the surface. "I had every right," I replied. "It has always been my gift, and a gift is not a salary, Clementine. It is not a budget line. It is not something you build a life around and then demand when it stops." She disconnected without another word. Margaret had stopped working. She was looking at me across the packing table with her reading glasses now down on her nose and both eyebrows raised. "Good Lord, Rosie," she said. "Go back to your apples, Margaret." She laughed, a real one this time, and reached for the next box. I was still smiling when I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel outside the barn. I looked through the open barn door. Lyle's car. He stepped out slowly, and even from a distance I could see that something had shifted in his face. He was holding a folded stack of papers against his side, and his hand around them was tight enough to whiten his knuckles. "Mom," he called across the yard, his voice rough at the edges. "I need to show you something." I set down the box I was holding and walked out to meet him. I closed the barn door behind us. I did not tell him yet that I had been waiting for this conversation since March. I brought him inside the cottage and put the kettle on. It was the only thing I knew to do with a son who looked the way Lyle looked, hollowed out like something had reached inside him and removed a load-bearing piece without his knowledge. He sat down at the small table and set the papers in front of him, but did not unfold them. He stared at them the way you stare at a document you have already read too many times and still cannot make yourself believe. "Where did you find those?" I asked, setting a mug in front of him. "Her laptop bag." His voice came out rough, scraped thin. "I was looking for the charging cable. It was just sitting there folded inside a zippered pocket. Like she forgot it was there, or like she stopped caring whether I found it." I turned to the narrow drawer beside the wood stove and pulled out a manila envelope. I had kept it there since March, 8 months of bank correspondence I had quietly accumulated after the statements began arriving with numbers that did not add up. When Lyle had taken out his mortgage in 2019, I had co-signed the loan to help him qualify. The bank had sent me duplicate statements ever since. Most months I filed them without concern. Then last November, a pattern emerged that made my chest go cold. I set my envelope beside his papers. He looked up at me confused. Then he opened his papers, and I opened mine, and we laid them side by side on the table. 7 wire transfers, spanning 14 months. Each one initiated from the joint checking account Lyle and Clementine shared, each one authorized with her signature, each one sent to the same destination, an account registered to Derek Saunders, Las Vegas, Nevada. Derek was Clementine's older brother. Lyle had met him twice at family gatherings and described him both times as someone who always needed something. The transfers totaled $50,000. Lyle's hands were trembling, not slightly genuinely shaking the way hands shake when the body understands something before the mind is ready to. He pressed both palms flat against the table as if he needed to feel something solid beneath him. "I thought we lost it," he said, and his voice cracked open on the last word. "She told me the investments failed. She showed me statements, different statements. I thought it was just gone. Bad decisions. I blamed myself for not paying closer attention." "She made sure you would," I said gently. "That takes planning, Lyle. That is not a mistake." He looked up at me then, and his eyes were red and filling fast. "How long have you known?" "Since March. I was waiting for the right moment." He made a sound low and broken, somewhere between a breath and something that wanted to become a sob. He pressed his knuckles against his mouth and held it back through sheer force, his shoulders rigid with the effort. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. We stayed that way for a long moment, while the kettle began to whistle softly on the wood stove, and the afternoon light came through the cottage window in long, warm bands across the floor. Finally, he lowered his hand. His voice, when it came, was quieter than I had heard it in years. "What do I do now, Mom?" I kept my hand over his. "Tonight, nothing. You drink your tea. You breathe. Tomorrow, you think clearly." He nodded slowly. He wrapped both hands around the mug and stared into it, and I watched my son sit with the full weight of the truth for the very first time. Outside, the apple trees stood in their patient rows, heavy and unhurried, waiting for the season to turn. The alert came at 3:47 in the morning. Not a sound, a vibration. My phone on the cot beside me buzzing twice in the particular pattern I had set for the cold storage barn camera. I was awake before the second pulse finished. I pulled up the live feed and sat there in the dark of the cottage watching the screen with the blanket still around my shoulders. A commercial flatbed truck had backed up to the cold storage barn door. Its headlights were off. The engine was running low and quiet the way engines run when someone wants them to go unnoticed. Clementine stood to one side in dark clothing, directing a heavy-set man in a cap, the driver, as he and another man began loading wooden crate after wooden crate onto the truck bed. 5 tons of organic apples, ready for the export shipment going out the following week. $30,000 of fruit packed and certified and registered under my name with the United States Department of Agriculture. Clementine had never spent a single day working the harvest. She knew the apples were valuable. She did not know they were federally traced. That was the difference between someone who lived on a farm and someone who wanted to use one. I dressed quickly. I put on my boots and my wool coat, and I walked across the dark yard to the cold storage barn without using my flashlight. Frank DeLuca heard my footsteps first. He straightened up and turned around, and even in the low light, I could see the moment his expression shifted from startled to deeply uncomfortable. He was a working man. He had the look of someone who had not been told the full story before agreeing to this job. Clementine stepped forward. "Rosalind, go back inside. This doesn't concern. It concerns everything on that truck," I said. I walked to the nearest crate and placed my hand on the QR certification label fixed to the upper right corner. Each label was registered with the USDA Organic Program and linked in real time to my electronic bill of lading my e-ball, filed with the New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets. I looked at Frank directly. "Every crate on that truck is federally registered under my USDA certification number," I said. "If you pull out of this property without my electronic release authorization, your load will be flagged at the Agricultural Inspection Station on Route 9W. They will impound the vehicle and contact your carrier. A CDL suspension review will follow. A commercial driver's license, once flagged for transporting unverified organic goods, takes 8 to 14 months to clear, if it clears at all." Frank pulled his cap off and pressed it against his chest. He turned to Clementine. "Ma'am, nobody said anything about federal certifications." Clementine's jaw tightened. "Just drive." "I've got a family," Frank said flatly. He dropped his cap back onto his head and climbed into the cab. His partner was already walking to the passenger side. The truck pulled forward slowly, swung around in the yard, and rolled out the gate into the pre-dawn dark without looking back. Clementine stood in the cold storage doorway surrounded by crates she could not move, and a plan that had just walked away in a flatbed truck. I pulled my coat tighter and looked at her. "Good night, Clementine," I said. I walked back to this cottage. I did not look back, but I heard her a single sharp sound, half breath and half something else, like a person discovering for the first time that a door they believed was open has been locked for quite some time. The sun came up slow and pale over the eastern orchard, the way it does in early September when the air has just started to carry the first real edge of autumn. I had not gone back to sleep after Frank DeLuca's truck disappeared down the farm road. Instead, I had made coffee, wrapped myself in Ephraim's old flannel shirt that I kept on the hook beside the cottage door, and walked the first 2 rows of apple trees in the gray pre-morning light. The fruit was close. Another 10 days, maybe 12. I could feel it in the weight of the branches and smell it in the air, that particular ripeness that sits just 1 degree below ready. Ephraim used to say the orchard told you when it was time. You just had to be quiet enough to listen. I was at the end of the 2nd row when I heard the back door of the main house open. Margaret arrived at 7:30 earlier than usual with a paper bag of corn muffins still warm from her oven. She took 1 look at my face and handed me the bag without a word. We sat on the low stone wall beside the barn and ate in the cool morning air while the light strengthened slowly across the property. "She tried to take the apples," I said. Margaret stopped chewing. She looked at me steadily for a long moment. Then she reached into the bag and took another muffin. And the truck driver left without them." She nodded slowly the way she nodded when something confirmed what she had already suspected. "What happens now, Rosie?" she asked. Before I could answer, I caught movement at the corner of my eye, Lyle's car already in the driveway, which surprised me. I had not expected him until the weekend. He must have driven out before dawn the way people do when they have spent the night deciding something. The back door of the main house banged open hard enough to bounce against the frame. Lyle came out first, moving fast, the bank statements in his hand. Behind him, Clementine followed in yesterday's clothes, her hair loose, her composure entirely gone. "Those signatures are mine because it was my money, too," she said, her voice rising sharp across the yard. "I had every right. $50,000! Lyle turned to face her, and his voice came out low and controlled in a way I had never heard from him before, not angry, but final. "You moved $50,000 to your brother without telling me once. Not once in 14 months. Clementine shifted her footing. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped into something colder and more deliberate. "Your mother has been turning you against me since the day we got here. Can't you see what she's doing? She wants to control you. She has always wanted to control you." Margaret set her muffin down on the stone wall beside her. Lyle did not look at me. He kept his eyes on his wife. "This has nothing to do with my mother," he said. "This is about you and me and $50,000 and a brother in Las Vegas." Clementine's chin lifted. Her voice sharpened into its final register, the one she used when every other approach had failed. "If you don't stand with me on this, I will make sure those children never set foot on this property again. Your mother will never see Mason and Lily. I will make certain of it." The yard went absolutely still. On the porch steps, Cordelia had appeared without any of us noticing. She stood with one hand pressed flat against the doorframe, her face the color of chalk, her eyes fixed on her daughter. Lyle's jaw tightened. He folded the papers slowly and put them in his back pocket. Then he looked up at Clementine with an expression I had not seen on my son's face in 4 years, clear and steady and entirely his own. That evening, I sat alone in the cottage with the lamp turned low and Ephraim's photograph in my hands. It was the one from our wedding, September of 1989, taken right here on this property before the farmhouse was finished, before we had anything but the land itself and the particular stubbornness that made us believe we could build something lasting on it. Ephraim was laughing in the photograph the way he laughed at everything that mattered to him, with his whole face nothing held back. I was leaning into his shoulder. The apple trees behind us were barely saplings, thin and uncertain, just finding their footing in the soil. I pressed my thumb gently along the edge of the frame. 3 years. It had been 3 years since I sat beside him in that upstairs bedroom and held his hand while the afternoon light moved across the floor. His last clear words to me, 2 days before the end, had been characteristically practical. "Don't let anyone rush you out of this place, Rosie," he had said. "Not for any reason, not for kindness, not for convenience, not for anything that sounds reasonable at the time." I had kept that promise every day since. I intended to keep it now. The following morning, I drove to Patricia Walsh's office in Kingston. Patricia had handled our estate planning since 2003, a sharp, spare woman who said exactly what she meant and nothing beyond it. She had drawn up Ephraim's will. She had helped me through probate. She knew this property the way a doctor knows a long-term patient. I sat across from her at the wide oak desk and told her what I needed. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I had always appreciated about her. When I finished, she pulled a fresh legal pad toward her and uncapped her pen. "A spendthrift trust under New York Estates Powers and Trusts Law," she said, writing as she spoke. "Lyle is primary beneficiary. The trust restricts his ability to transfer or assign his interest, and it protects the asset from claims by any creditor or spouse, current or future. And if anyone attempts to legally contest the farm's status as separate property," I said, "or applies pressure on Lyle to transfer ownership before my death, the remainder interest shifts to the Hudson Valley Farm Preservation Foundation." Patricia said, finishing my sentence without looking up. "That is an ironclad disincentive, Rosalind. Nobody with any sense will push once that clause is in place." She slid the draft across the desk. 40 minutes later, I read every line. Then I picked up her pen and signed my name at the bottom in the clear, unhurried cursive Ephraim had always teased me about. "You have good handwriting for someone who just rattled 4 different attorneys," Patricia said dryly. I set the pen down. "I only rattled 1. The other 3 haven't shown up yet." She looked at me over the top of her glasses for a moment. Then she almost smiled, which for Patricia Walsh was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Walking to my car afterward, my phone buzzed. A message from Lyle. 4 words. "Mom, tonight, just us." I got in the car and typed back too. "Come home." He arrived just after 8 when the sky had gone the deep blue that comes before full dark. I heard his car on the gravel and had the kettle on before he reached the cottage door. He looked worse than I expected. Not disheveled, Lyle had always been neat even under pressure, but worn down in a way that went deeper than appearance. The kind of tired that accumulates over years, not days. He had lost weight since spring. The angles of his face were sharper than I remembered, and when he sat down at the small table, he moved carefully, like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and was not sure what happened to his body once he set it down. "I owe you an apology," he said before I had even poured the water. "Lyle, no." He pressed both hands flat on the table. "Let me say it. I have been trying to say it for 2 years, and I kept finding reasons not to." He looked up at me, and his eyes were red at the rims, and completely open, no deflection, no apology, in advance for the apology. I knew something was wrong, not just with the money, with all of it. The way she talked about you, the reasons we always had for not coming out here. I told myself I was keeping the peace. His jaw tightened against itself. I wasn't keeping anything. I was just choosing not to see. I set the mug in front of him and sat down across the table. "You're here now," I said. "I should have been here 4 years ago." His voice cracked on the last word and he stopped, turned his face slightly away and pressed his jaw tight, the muscles along his cheek working hard against something that wanted very badly to come out. His shoulders pulled inward once before he forced them level again. I reached across and put my hand over his. "Your father used to say that people come to the truth at the speed they can bear it," I told him. "Not faster, not slower. You got here, Lyle. That is what matters." He turned his hand over beneath mine and held on. We sat that way for a while with the lamp burning low between us and the sound of the orchard settling into the night outside. Branches shifting, leaves turning in the small breeze that always came off the hills after dark. After a time, he asked about the documents I had signed that morning. I told him about the trust, not every detail, just the shape of it, that the farm was protected, that no one could use it as a weapon against him or against me. He nodded slowly, absorbing it. Then he said, "She told me this morning that if I don't agree to sign property papers by the end of the week, she's leaving." I looked at my son across the small table, at the face I had watched change from infant to boy to man, and I said it as gently and as clearly as I knew how. "Then let her leave Lyle." He did not answer right away. He wrapped both hands around his mug and stared into the steam rising from it. But this time, what settled between us did not feel like avoidance. It felt like a man finally standing on solid ground, testing his own weight, finding that it held. Before I tell you what happened the morning Clementine finally made her choice comment 13 below, I want to know you are still here. A reminder, this story contains fictional elements crafted to carry a message worth hearing. The names, the farm, the details. Some of these have been shaped for the telling. If you prefer stories presented differently, now is a natural place to pause. I was already awake when I heard her moving. 6:14 in the morning, the sky still gray at the edges, mist sitting low over the orchard. Through the cottage window, I watched the back door of the main house open, and Clementine come out pulling a suitcase behind her, then a second one. She was dressed and composed, hair, pinned back mouth, set in a line that told me she had made her decision somewhere in the dark hours and had spent the rest of the night hardening herself around it. She set both cases at the edge of the courtyard. Then she stood in the center of the yard and called out toward the house, her voice carrying sharp and clear through the morning air. "Lyle, I need you out here, right now." A long moment passed. Then the back door opened and Lyle stepped out in yesterday's shirt, barefoot on the cold brick, his hair unsettled from sleep. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at the suitcases and then at his wife. Clementine's chin lifted. When she spoke, every word was measured and deliberate, the way words are when they have been rehearsed through a sleepless night. "I'm giving you one last chance. You come with me right now, and we deal with this together, or you stay here with her." She did not look at the cottage. She kept her eyes fixed on Lyle's face. "But if you stay, we are finished. I am not coming back. Do you understand me?" The yard was very still. A single bird started somewhere in the upper orchard and then went quiet. Lyle looked at his wife for a long moment, long enough that I found myself holding my breath without meaning to. Then something in his face shifted slowly and completely, the way a landscape changes when the cloud cover finally breaks. He straightened his back. He lifted his head. "Then we're finished, Clementine," he said. "I want a divorce." Clementine went absolutely rigid. Whatever response she had prepared for argument negotiation, the particular guilt she had always been able to press into him like a thumb against a bruise. This was not it. Her lips parted. No sound came out. For the first time since she had pulled into this courtyard 2 months ago, Clementine Hartwell had nothing to say. The back door opened a third time. Cordelia came down the porch steps, slowly dressed, a small bag over one shoulder. She walked across the yard without hurrying. She passed her daughter without stopping, and Clementine turned, reaching out. "Mom, don't," Cordelia said. Her voice was quiet, but it had iron in it. She kept walking. She came to the cottage door and knocked twice, and when I opened it, her eyes were full, and her chin was trembling, and her whole body seemed to be working very hard to hold itself upright. "Rosalind," she said, "I'm so sorry. I should have called you myself, before any of this. I should have picked up the phone and called." My throat tightened. I stepped back from the door. "Come in, Cordelia," I said. "I'll put the kettle on." Behind her across the courtyard, I heard the sound of a suitcase wheel on brick, steady, unhurried, growing smaller. Then the gate, and then nothing. 3 weeks later, the orchard told me it was time. I knew it the way I always knew, not from a calendar or a forecast, but from the particular weight of the air on a Tuesday morning in late September, the way the light came through the leaves at a lower angle and turned everything amber and unhurried. I walked the first row before breakfast and pressed my thumb gently against a Honeycrisp near the end of the line. It came away clean and easy, no resistance at all. I called Lyle at 7:15. "Harvest starts Saturday," I said. "I'll be there Friday night," he said. He was. He arrived with Mason and Lily tumbling out of the back seat before the car had fully stopped, sneakers untied, both of them already running toward the orchard with their arms out like the apple trees were old friends they had been missing. Mason was 8 now and all knees and opinions. Lily was 6 and had Ephraim's eyes, that particular clear gray that noticed everything and gave nothing away too quickly. Cordelia came out of the cottage to meet them, and Mason crashed into her at full speed, nearly knocking her sideways. She grabbed him with both arms and laughed a real laugh, full and surprised, the kind I had not heard from her once in the weeks since Clementine left. Margaret arrived Saturday morning with her canvas tote and her reading glasses and took one look at the assembled group and said, "Well, this is more like it." We worked through the morning in long, easy rows, Lyle and Cordelia on the ladders, Margaret and I sorting at the table, Mason carrying the smaller crates with enormous concentration, Lily walking behind me and asking questions about everything she touched. "Grandma," she said, holding up a Honeycrisp with a faint brown spot near the stem, "why do some apples have spots?" I crouched down to her level, the knees of my work pants pressing into the cool grass. "Those are the ones that grew through the hardest weather," I told her. "Late frost, heavy rain winds that bent the branches all the way down." I turned the apple in her small hands so she could see the whole of it. "But they stayed on the tree anyway, and the ones that hold on through the hard weather." I tapped the spot gently. They're usually the sweetest ones. Lily considered this with the gravity that 6-year-olds bring to information they intend to keep. Then she wiped the apple carefully on her jacket and took a bite. Her eyes went wide. "It is sweet," she said like a small scientist, confirming a hypothesis. I stood up and looked over at Lyle. He was on the ladder above us, one hand steadying himself against the trunk, and he had stopped picking. He was watching his daughter with an expression so open and unguarded that it made my chest ache with something that was not quite sadness and not quite joy, but lived very close to both. That evening, when the others had gone inside and the orchard was quiet in the blue dusk, I sat on the porch steps of the main house, my steps, and opened the drawer of the small table by the door. The key was where I had left it. a plain brass key on a worn leather fob, and on the fob in Ephraim's handwriting, RV for our trip. I held it in my palm and felt its weight. In the weeks after Clementine left Cordelia and I had found a quiet rhythm, good mornings at the fence line, occasional help carrying harvest boxes, the kind of proximity that builds familiarity without requiring explanation. She had never once asked me to invite her in. I had noticed that. She came to the main house that afternoon with 2 mugs of tea, mine black, the way she had noticed I took it and hers with a little milk, and knocked on the kitchen door with her elbow because both hands were full. I let her in. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same table where Ephraim had read the morning paper for 30 years, and for a little while, neither of us reached for our mugs. The afternoon light came through the window above the sink in long, warm bands, and the house was quiet in the particular way it gets in late September, when the harvest work is done for the day and everything settles. Then Cordelia set her hands flat on the table and looked at me directly, and I could see what it cost her the way her jaw tightened and her eyes went bright and painful before she made herself hold steady. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All of it, from the beginning." I nodded. I picked up my mug and held it in both hands and listened. She told me that her lease had run out in April. Not because the landlord had decided not to renew, because Clementine had quietly let it expire, without telling her. When Cordelia discovered she had 30 days to vacate, she had called her daughter in a panic. Clementine had been ready with an answer before Cordelia finished her sentence. "She told me you had already said yes," Cordelia said. Her voice thickened, and she pressed her lips together hard for a moment before continuing. "She said you were lonely out here, and that you had called her specifically and asked us all to come. She described this house to me, the orchard, the view from the upstairs window, the kitchen where we were going to cook together." Her hands curled inward on the table. "I packed everything I owned. I gave away my furniture. I canceled my library card for heaven's sake. I believed every word she told me." Her eyes filled. One tear tracked down the left side of her face, and she did not wipe it away, just let it go the way a person does when they are too tired to manage appearances anymore. "I should have called you," she said. "One phone call, 30 seconds. I have no excuse for not making it." "You trusted your daughter," I said. "That is not something that requires an excuse." She shook her head tightly. "It requires better judgment." We sat with that for a moment. Outside, a breeze moved through the upper orchard, and I could hear the soft sound of branches giving and returning. "I want to stay," Cordelia said. "Not as a guest, not as anyone's arrangement." She straightened in her chair, and something in her posture reminded me of a woman reclaiming her own spine. "I want to rent the cottage at fair market rate. I can help with the organic packaging, the canning, the holiday baking orders. I will earn my place here properly, or I will not stay at all." I looked at her across the table for a long moment. "Can you make pie crust from scratch?" I asked. She blinked. Then a small startled laugh escaped her, the kind that surprises the person laughing most of all. "Lard and butter," she said. "My grandmother's recipe. No shortening ever." I picked up my mug. "Rent is $600 a month," I said. "The cottage has a new wood stove. You move in Sunday." Cordelia pressed both hands over her mouth. Her shoulders shook once hard, and then she pulled them level and nodded, and her eyes were so full that the afternoon light caught in them like water. November came in gray and cold the way it always does in Hudson Valley, not dramatically, not all at once, but with a steady, patient insistence that summer was finished, and there was no use arguing about it. I was in the main house kitchen making soup when Lyle called. I knew from the first syllable of his voice that it was over. "Walsh won," he said. And then, because he was his father's son and had learned to lead with facts before feelings, all of it. I turned the burner down and sat at the kitchen table. He told me what had happened in Patricia Walsh's office in Kingston that morning. Clementine's attorney had opened by arguing that because Lyle was my sole heir and the anticipated future owner of the farm, the property's value should be factored into the marital estate during asset division. Walsh had shut that down in under 4 minutes. The farm was titled entirely in my name, under New York Domestic Relations Law section. 236 property owned solely by one spouse before marriage or acquired independently during marriage is classified as separate property. It cannot be divided in a divorce proceeding between the other parties. The farm had never been Lyle's to divide. It had never been Clementine's to claim. Then Walsh had placed the Spendthrift Trust documentation on the table. The trust Lyle stood to inherit was legally structured to prevent any beneficiary from transferring or assigning their interest, and to shield that interest from claims by creditors or any current or future spouse. The moment the trust had been signed and filed, the farm had become, in Walsh's words, untouchable by anyone except me. Clementine's attorney had asked for a recess. They came back with nothing. On the matter of custody, the wire transfer records had done their work thoroughly. 7 transfers, 14 months, $50,000, all documented, all authorized by Clementine's signature, none disclosed to Lyle. Under New York family law, financial misconduct of that scale, combined with no fixed residence and an income she could not document consistently to the court's satisfaction, weighed heavily against her in the best interest evaluation. The family court had awarded Lyle primary residential custody of Mason and Lily. Clementine would have scheduled visitation. She didn't say anything when it was read out, Lyle said. His voice was steady, but I could hear the exhaustion threaded through it, the particular tiredness of someone who has been holding tension in their body for months and does not yet know how to release it. She just picked up her folder and left. "Are you all right?" I asked. A pause. "I think I will be," he said. "I think that's the most honest answer I've got right now." "That's enough," I told him. After we hung up, I sat at the table for a long time with my hands wrapped around my soup bowl, feeling the warmth come through the ceramic into my palms. Outside the kitchen window, the last of the apple leaves were letting go, spinning down 1 or 2 at a time in the gray November air, unhurried, each one falling exactly when it was ready. That evening I went to the garage. I opened the RV door and climbed into the driver's seat. The interior smelled of old leather and the faint ghost of Ephraim's aftershave. On the dashboard, tucked behind the sun visor where I had left it 3 years ago and never moved, was a folded note card in his handwriting. I opened it. "Route 20 West. Start there, Rosie. Start there." My throat tightened so hard it ached. I sat in the dark of the garage for a long time, just breathing, just holding the card in both hands. Then I started making a list. The first snow came on a Thursday in early December. Not a heavy snow, just a dusting that settled overnight on the orchard and turned every bare branch white and particular in the morning light. I stood on the back porch with my coffee and watched it for a long time before I went inside to make the calls. By 8 o'clock, they were all there. Lyle arrived first with Mason and Lily. The children bundled into their winter coats and already angling toward the orchard to see the snow on the apple trees. Cordelia came out of the cottage with her hair pinned up and flour still on her apron from the morning's baking. Margaret appeared at the side gate with a thermos of coffee and the expression of someone who already suspected what was happening and had come anyway to make sure it was done properly. I asked them to gather in the yard. I reached into my coat pocket and took out the first set of keys, the main house, the cold storage barn, the smart gate, and held them out to Lyle. He looked at them for a moment without taking them. His jaw worked once. Then he reached out and closed his hand around them slowly, the way you accept something you understand the full weight of. "This is yours to take care of," I said. "Not to own yet, to take care of. There's a difference, and you know it." He nodded. He could not speak, but he nodded. I turned to Cordelia and took out the second thing, a green cloth notebook, soft with years of handling. Every harvest schedule going back to 1993. Every organic buyer, every seasonal worker, every recipe for every product we had ever sold at market. 30 years of this farm in handwriting that moved between mine and Ephraim's, depending on who had been at the table that evening. Cordelia took it in both hands and pressed it against her chest, and her eyes went bright and wet, and she pulled her lips together hard to hold herself steady. "Don't lose it," I told her. "I won't," she said. Her voice came out thick and sure at the same time. Margaret raised her thermos toward me in a small salute. "You're really doing it, Rosie," she said. "Ephraim bought that RV so we could see this country together," I said. "He didn't get the chance. I'm going for both of us." Margaret pressed her lips together and looked away at the orchard, blinking rapidly. Mason tugged at my sleeve. "Grandma, when are you coming back?" I crouched down to his level, my knees cold on the thin snow. "Every harvest," I said. "That is my promise. Every single harvest I will be right here in this orchard." He considered this with great seriousness, and then threw both arms around my neck so hard it rocked me backward on my heels. I caught myself and held on and pressed my face into his hair and breathed him in the cold air and something sweet underneath apple and wool and little boy. Lily came next. She did not say anything. She simply walked up and wrapped both arms around me and held on her small face pressed into my shoulder, her grip surprisingly strong for someone 6 years old. I closed my eyes. Lyle stood at the edge of the group, the keys in his fist, watching. When I finally stood and looked at him, he opened his mouth and I shook my head gently before he could start. "Take care of this land," I said, "and take care of yourself. Those are the same thing." He pressed the back of his hand against his eyes once hard and fast, and then dropped it and straightened up and looked like his father for just a moment in the snow in the cold December light. I walked to the garage. The engine started on the first try. Ephraim had always said it would. He had serviced that engine himself every spring for 11 years, the way he maintained everything he cared about, not because it needed it yet, but because he believed that care given in advance was the only kind that truly counted. I sat in the driver's seat and listened to it run and felt something loosen in my chest that I had not realized was still held tight. I pulled out of the garage slowly. The gravel crunched under the tires. I did not look in the mirror. Route 20, west, opened up in front of me the way Ephraim had always described it, gently, without drama. The road just becoming wider and quieter as the town fell away behind and the hills took over on both sides. The December light was low and thin and came through the windshield at an angle that turned everything ahead of me, silver and unhurried. I had driven this road 100 times on farm errands. It looked entirely different from the driver's seat of a vehicle with nowhere specific to be. I thought about the past 5 months the way you think about a storm after it has passed, not with anger, not with satisfaction exactly, but with the clear-eyed recognition of someone who went through something real and came out on the other side still standing. Clementine had arrived in July, certain that the word no was a temporary condition that persistence and pressure could dissolve. She'd been wrong about that. She had been wrong about a great many things. But the thing I kept returning to there on Route 20 with the Catskills going white in my peripheral vision was not Clementine at all. It was Lyle on a cold porch step, with his keys in his fist, looking like his father. It was Lily's arms stronger than they had any right to be at 6 years old. It was Cordelia pressing a green notebook against her chest, like something precious, which it was. It was Margaret blinking at the orchard with her thermos raised, not trusting herself to speak, which for Margaret was the highest possible tribute. My phone buzzed on the seat beside me. I pulled over at a wide gravel shoulder and picked it up. A message from Lyle. A photograph Mason and Lily in the orchard, cheeks red with cold, each of them holding a single apple they had found, still clinging to the highest branches after the harvest. They were grinning at the camera with the uncomplicated joy of children who feel entirely at home in a place. Below the photograph, Lyle had written 4 words. They said it's sweet. I set the phone down. I looked out at the road ahead, long and silver and completely open. My throat ached in the way it does when you feel too many things at once, and none of them are wrong. I thought of what Ephraim would have said sitting in the passenger seat where his note card still rested on the dashboard. He would have looked at that photograph and laughed the way he laughed at everything that mattered, with his whole face, nothing held back. And then he would have said exactly what he always said. I told you the farm protects itself, Rosie. Strength is not measured by how loudly you refuse. It is measured by how clearly you see what is yours to protect, and how calmly, how completely you do exactly that. One word, one decision at a time. I put the RV in drive. The road went west. The light held. And somewhere behind me, through 5 acres of bare winter branches, the Hartwell farm stood exactly as it always had, patient, unhurried, and entirely itself. Looking back on everything that happened, I do not think of myself as someone who fought back. I think of myself as someone who finally stopped stepping aside. For too long, I told myself that keeping quiet was the same as keeping peace. It was not. Silence is not peace. Silence is just permission wearing a patient face. If you are watching this and someone in your life is doing what Clementine did, moving slowly, taking, quietly counting on your kindness to keep you still, please do not wait as long as I did. You do not have to be angry to hold your ground. You only have to be clear. I believe God puts certain people in our lives not to take from us, but to show us exactly how much we are worth fighting for. That lesson cost me a summer. I would pay it again. These are revenge stories with Mom that I never planned to live. But family drama has a way of finding you whether you are ready or not. What matters is who you are when it does. Every family drama carries a lesson underneath the pain, and every family drama eventually shows you who truly belongs in your life. This has been one of those revenge stories with Mom, the kind that starts with one quiet word and ends with a long, open road. These revenge stories with Mom are worth telling because someone out there needs to hear them. If this story moved something in, you leave a word in the comments. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have not yet subscribed, because the next story is already waiting, and it will find you exactly when you need it. Thank you truly for staying until the very last word. The stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted entirely for reflection and understanding. If this kind of content is not right for you at this time, please feel free to step away and choose what serves you better. No hard feelings and no judgment here.